Hello, Pauline Black, mainstay of the Selector.
I wouldn't call myself mainstay. I'd call myself one of the people who have been in the Selector at any point in time, but I am the person who has remained the longest. The name of the Selector, I mean, for one thing, let's get one thing straight, right? The Selector is in the singular, which everyone else is the specials or the this, or, you know, the kinks or the this or the that or whatever. We are the Selector. And therefore I always felt, and I suppose this is somewhat in hindsight, that the name is up for grabs. There were 7 people in that band. Everyone has had a go in some ways or another of kind of, you know, like taking the name of that band and doing something with it. And when we reformed in 1991, after a 10-year hiatus, Neil and myself got together with some other people that we knew and who really facilitated that whole kind of, you know, getting back together again, because we wouldn't have done otherwise.
That was Bad Manners, yeah?
That was 2 members of Bad Manners, not Bad Manners as such. And Bad Manners is basically Ducky Trendle, isn't it? It's Buster Bloodvessel. I mean, you know, that is Bad Manners in that respect. And there we were. Neil and I found ourselves together in the same band again. Neil being the founding member of the Selector, i.e. the instrumental version of a song called The Selector. And we spent 2 years together and really came up against the same problems, I guess, as what kind of, you know, dissolved us in the first place in the 1981.
Can you tell us a bit more about those?
I suppose, I mean, those problems basically are just, we get along. We get along very, very well. We get along very, very well. But the way that we kind of move in time and the length of time it takes us to make decisions, do things, write songs, any of those kind of things are 2 different things. And that makes it very, very hard. And I also think that Neil always wanted to be in his own band. He really wanted to make his own decisions. He wanted to be the lead singer, all of those kind of things. And as much as maybe he liked what I did, I think that he is probably far happier in being in Neil Davis's Box of Blues, which I think is very telling in itself, that he's called it Box of Blues. He's put himself in his own box, and that box is full of blues, and my box just isn't full of blues. Do you know what I mean? I can only think forward and what we're going to do next, and how else can you kind of, you know, do something with the things that I believe, and all of that.
And staying in the last 10 years before we go down memory lane, of the 3 albums, the Happy album, Hairspray and Crew Britannia, which of those?
Oh, there's another one now. There's one called Reel to Reel, which is actually out now.
Tell us about
it. And there is also a spin-off project, which is Selector Acoustic, which is myself and Nick Welch, who is the bass player in the Selector, but comes and does acoustic guitar with myself in Selector Acoustic. And we're 2 albums down the road now. And this last album, which is called Requiem for a Black Soul, I think is absolutely brilliant. And
acoustic Selector.
It's kind of it's acoustic Selector is just another means of expression in those terms. You know?
Right. And of the other 3 albums during the 90s, which was the one that moved you?
None of them. Do you know what I mean? Everyone wants you to pick your favourite album. I can pick my favourite Selector track of all time, which is Celebrate the Bullet. But I actually can't pick my favourite Selector album. They're all different. They're all of the time that they were actually made and the time when the songs were written and stuff like that. And I wouldn't have sung on any of them or written some of the songs on any of them if I didn't actually believe in them. So to say which is my favourite is a completely moot point.
And then the main thing being in the 90s, when you got back together again, you were determined still to do songs that had a message of some kind, some of them, that were political songs.
Well, I can't see any point in writing songs about nothing.
American Screaming,
you know,
was inspired in...
California Screaming was basically inspired by the fact that the Rodney King thing had just happened. We'd all just seen an American black geezer battered silly by a load of LA police. And we'd been out in the States at the time, gigging. And the opening line of the song, which is, you know, once upon a time a king had a dream, and then 3 LA Cops made Another King Scream. I just think that those two things kind of bookended a situation which started off in the days of the civil rights movement, in the days of myself being young and living in an adopted white family in Romford, which is the breeding ground in the National Front, watching on the TV black people in the southern states of America being hosed by fire hoses because they wanted to sit at a lunch counter in Alabama or one of the deep south states. And here we were in 1991, and really nothing much had changed. You know, it's still going on. The same problems are still there. And I mean, that was also a thing that I visited on the Celebrate the Bullet album with Bristol and Miami, which was the same kind of thing. You know, because there were riots in Miami at that time, there were riots in St. Paul's in Bristol, and you know, and they are themes which constantly recur.
Right.
And I'm kind of shocked in a way.
Yeah.
And here we are in, what are we, 2003. And I mean, I just have to say this because I mean, there's, in preparation for actually doing this with you, right, I thought, hell, I ought to read some of those like long time ago sort of interviews that we used to do in 1981 and 1980 and things like that when we first got together, because it's kind of the thing like you collect the press, but you don't actually read it. And I mean, you know, 25 years later, which is what we nearly are, I mean, hell, I'm not going to sit down and read all this kind of stuff. But I thought, well, I ought to read it because, you know, you're going to know loads of things and I ain't going to know them and all this kind of stuff. So I thought, well, I better check some facts so I can stick in some facts. And I was out last night. This is a bit of a digression, but anyway, I was out last night and I was walking my dog. And I was walking down this street and I walked past this house and there was a girl who was having a row with another girl on a doorstep. And as I walked past, the girl, one of the girls, the girl who was standing on the doorstep having a row with this other person, kind of checked herself. I didn't really take any notice of this because I was more interested in my dog. And I walked another 50 yards down the street and suddenly I heard, "Excuse me." And I thought, who's that? So I turned round and this girl said, "Excuse me, my sister's a racist." And I thought, what? And she said, if you heard what she said, which I didn't, she said, "I just want you to know that I don't endorse that. I'm not a racist." And I just thought, oh, you know, I mean, for a minute I was quite startled and I just looked around and I thought, and I just said, well, it's all right, darling, you know, I didn't hear it, so, you know, forget about it and thank you for the apology or whatever. And I walked on and I kind of put that on what I'd been reading prior to going out for my walk, and I thought, this is 25 years later. Somebody is still apologising to me for being racist. And we live in a society now which is supposed to be a cosmopolitan society.
Politically correct. You
know, and politically correct. I'm not interested in political correctness. You know,
who is?
I'm not really, you know, that isn't for me kind of the answer to anything. I'd rather people say what they thought.
Yeah.
I'd rather the girl said to me what she thought to my face rather than utter it to someone else who has to apologise for it. But all of that aside, I just thought we really haven't moved on that far. We're just fooling ourselves that we've moved on that far into this new millennium. And if ever there was a reason for carrying on doing the Selector, for pushing in some ways the kind of ethos of two-tone, then that is it. You know, it's still there. And we can pat ourselves on the back in the kind of wake of the St. Lawrence Inquiry, of the Lawrence Inquiry and things like that, and tell ourselves that, you know, yes, we know about institutionalised racism now, and yes, we're going to stamp it out and things like this, but it's still there, and it's not just blacks. I mean, it's just anybody, really. It just kind of doesn't fit that wasp.
And staying in the present again on the music of the Selector right now and in the last 10 years, there was a move away from the punk ska, wasn't there? It wasn't as pronounced. It was some soul-y influences coming. What's it like at the moment? Are you still doing that ska beat?
I always think that the way that the Selector was actually set up was along the lines that we fused reggae and ska, I guess, with soul and punk and rock. Yeah. And that gives you a wide brief as far as I'm concerned. Everybody knows now that R&B doesn't mean the same as what R&B meant, you know,
In
20,
50s,
30 years
yeah,
ago and
yeah.
stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, you can't, we live in a society which is full of other people making music.
Yeah.
You're not going to be totally indifferent to new things coming along, new technologies coming along and all those kind of things. And if we can experiment with that and fuse it with a ska beat, then fair enough.
Right. Now, going back 25 years, which we have to, Coventry, we just said that anecdote about what happened last night. What was Coventry like in the late 70s? Was it a Motown in decline? Was it a very depressed place?
In the late 70s, yes, I would say that Coventry was a pretty depressed place. A lot of the motor industry was closing down, and people were being bought out. There were lots of people who were going onto the dole,
Racially
getting
tense?
their redundancy payments and buying a taxi. But unfortunately, 100,000 other people bought taxis, and you can't, you know, Coventry in decline was not going to be able to sustain that many taxis.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was a lot of racial prejudice at the time, not just against blacks, but against Asians, mainly because of a lot of people were coming in from Bangladesh and from Kenya and Uganda, and you know, English people just weren't used to seeing other faces other than their own sweet white selves.
Right, right. And you were in early 79, you were sort of intent on getting your own band together, weren't you, with Desmond Brown, Lawton Brown? You were rehearsing with those two guys?
Well, I'd been doing a lot of things. At that time, I was a radiographer at Walsgrave Hospital in Coventry, and I'd started going to a pub called the Old Dyer's Arms, which was fairly hilarious, I suppose. But I taught myself to play guitar, and I just used to go down there and I just used to sing some songs and stuff, and I was a bit of a novelty, really, because one, there weren't many women down there. There was one other woman, but I mean, I kind of saw her off and she decided there was no contest after. And neither of us were very good, I have to say. But I suppose I was just a bit more tenuous than she was.
And you took your songs there, yeah?
So
from the
I took
start?
my songs there,
Yeah,
and eventually somebody gave me a gig, and I remember getting a quid per song for a gig, which amounted to sort of 10 quid for 10 songs, and I was really happy. And in the audience that night was one black person, and that black person was a guy called Lawton Brown, who at that time was a political science student at Warwick University. And he came up to me and said, "Oh, what are you doing this for?" He said, "Come and write songs with me." I actually think that was a prelude to getting into my pants, but I mean, all that aside, I was very naive in those days and I actually didn't think that people did things like that. I wasn't that familiar with kind of, you know, that wasn't until I joined a band that I realised what really men joined a band for. And but anyway, I mean, that never happened, but we did write songs together.
Right.
And I used to regularly sit around his house and we come up with songs. I mean, you know, one of the ones that we came up with was They Make Me Mad, which appeared on the first the Too Much Pressure album. And the house that he lived in was like a typical student house, and you know, anyone else who wanted to be there. And one of the other people who was there was Charles Brembridge, or H, who was would then go on to be the drummer in the Selector. But he was at that time also in a band called Hard Top 22, with Charlie Anderson, with Gap Hendrickson.
And Charlie Anderson was a very charismatic figure
He
around
was a very
town.
charismatic figure around town. When I say very charismatic, he looked like Bob Marley. That was enough in those days to make you very charismatic. There wasn't anybody else who got their locks as long. And really, that was his main claim to fame. That, and he was a very good-looking geezer anyway. And so we carried on, Lawton and I carried on writing songs and stuff like that. This went on for probably about sort of 6-7 months or whatever. Then we met some other people, and they came into the band, some people in Leamington that he knew from
the band
university.
have a name?
No, not at all. I mean, we just all jammed together and occasionally got together and tried to make up stuff. But then it started coalescing into something a little bit more than that, with the advent of Desmond Brown being brought into this, who was an excellent Hammond organ player, and was very influenced by you know, other Hammond organ players. I mean, I think he'd cite, funnily enough, Dave Greenfield of the Stranglers as one of those people. But Booker T and the MGs and that, he was very into that. And again, you know, he was a huge guy, over 6 foot, and again, very charismatic. And so a band began to kind of form around that.
And then fate took a hand when Linval Golding...
Linval Golding was a friend of Desmond's.
Right.
And they, of course, had the whole Specials thing going at that time. And but I mean, it hadn't kind of come to anything as it
was. That whole
Gangsters
scene
was about to be released, so
right.
it was kind of, you know, prior to that. And he came along, and I'm still to this day not really sure why, but he came along, and he came along to a rehearsal that we were doing at the Wheatsheaf pub on Foles Hill Road, where we'd push the organ up the road just to get it there. It was about
Hammond's
250
massive.
yards. And Hammond's pretty fucking massive, you know.
Yeah.
And there we were, and I was dimly aware that Linval was in this band, and yeah, they were about to sort of make it, or on the verge of making it and stuff. And he invited myself and Desmond and H along to a meeting at this house in Hillfield.
Very intriguing.
Which, well, I didn't really think that it was anything at the time. I mean, it was just some other musicians to meet.
Yeah.
I kind of knew it was Charlie, who was like the leading light of Hard Top 22, who were the main band in Coventry at that time, as I saw it. Anyway, they were the main local band. And so I turned up at this house, and it was a very small room. It was like a 2 up, 2 down, and Charlie was there with his wife, was in the back, kind of, you know, cooking up some rice and peas and stuff like this with her daughter. And there was a whole load of people all sat round, and I always remember there was one white guy, and that was Neil Davis, and his wife was sitting on the other side of him, Jane Davis, who did the artwork on the second album, Celebrate the Bullet. And he was just kind of sitting there, and I walked in, there was a long sofa, and that's kind of what I saw as you walked through the door. And I said hi, and I just kind of sat there and listened to all this. And I remember very ceremoniously a 7-inch single was taken out of a white sleeve. And on one side, of course, was the Specials, Gangsters versus the Selector, which was Neil's instrumental.
So
on
it
the
had
other
just
side.
recently been released, yeah?
Which had just recently been released, and Neil had recorded 2 years before with John Bradbury from the Specials, who then went on to be a drummer in the Specials. And funnily enough, the guy, I mean, the kind of linchpin in this, I suppose, which is Barry Jones, who played trombone on it, which is the main lead line of the melodic line through it.
And Roger Lomas.
Who owned the sweet shop. That I used as my local news agents, kind of thing, completely unbeknownst to me. And Roger Lomas had recorded it in the shed in his garden in Broad Street, somewhere in Foles Hill. And we sat there and we listened to this, and I thought, it's quite groovy kind of thing, you know. And then the conversation kind of got going, and I'm not too sure exactly where that conversation went, but at the end of that night, we had all agreed that we were going to meet up at a place called the Binley Oak and rehearse. And I thought, oh well, okay, kind of thing, you know. And that is exactly what happened. We went down, and I was vaguely, I suppose, aware that maybe I was auditioning. That they weren't too sure, this whole group of guys, whether they wanted a woman in the band or not.
So it's never as formal as, we're going to form a band, it's going to be called the Selector.
No, it
and
was
we
never
want,
really that formal. I mean, I suppose that must have got said, but I mean, to my recollection, it just kind of, it was a foregone conclusion. Whatever happened coalesced around this 7 inches of vinyl. And without anything really ever actually being said. I mean, that was the wonderful thing about the Selector. Nothing ever actually got said. It all kind of skirted around a situation. And I turned up, and I had a song which was They Make Me Mad. And I remember kind of telling people what the chords were and singing it. And they thought, oh, well, this is okay. And they ended up playing it, and I sang it, and that was it, really. I was kind of in
the band.
And we just went from there, and we rehearsed very diligently for 6 weeks, I think, or something like that. And then went out and did some gigs.
And one of the first sort of showcase gigs was at Leeds at the F Club, wasn't it?
It was at the F Club. The actual first gig we ever did was in a place in Gloucester, which kind of escapes, the name of it really doesn't kind of, you know. But some people had ties with Gloucester and were, you know, had spent time in Gloucester. Because there was a black community around Gloucester, so Linval, I think, was maybe not from Gloucester, but certainly had ties with Gloucester. So down there we went, we did this gig, and I remember I wore pink spandex trousers for some obscure reason. I can't remember why now. And I think I had an afro. I think Desmond had an afro at that time. Charlie, I think, wore a kind of beige safari suit because that was very in the black community at that time in the 70s. And I guess the only person who probably looked vaguely like anything that we might have ended up with at the time, because he had a pair of stay press, was Neil.
Right.
And he had a pair of loafers. And God knows what we looked like. I mean, I dread to think. But the songs were sort of there. I mean, you know, the My Radios were there, the Too Much Pressures were there, and stuff like that. And
the album, the first album, had been already written, just about.
Well, had come together.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it had been written anyway. I mean, things like On My Radio, Missing Words, and things like that were Neil had, but they were in a rock format. They weren't in any kind of format which was going to make them into ska records. It was Hard Top 22 and myself made them into that. You know, and he was very, very up for... Well, let me put it this way. I think that the measure of any song, particularly, you know, a classic song like On My Radio, which I think stands up for all time and still does today, is the fact that you can do it in any genre. It can be a rock song, it can be a reggae song, it can be a ska song, or, you know, and it can be the definitive way that we did it. And so I think that we took those songs, if you like, and kind of wrung their necks and fashioned this whole thing into a set. And,
now, on your Radio 2 series that you did on the two-tone movement, there was quite a sort. There was quite a. It's just at that point, you said, I think, interviewing possibly Neil, that the whole thing came together
you
very.
See, they let me and Neil together. We did not interview each other. Believe me.
I was surprised to hear the two voices apparently in the same room. And anyway, the point being made there was that the way that ska came together with punk was basically, first of all, you used to do sort of bits of a song that were rock or punk, and then it'd go into total ska, then it would alternate, and then somehow the selector was the ringing machine by which those two sort of...
and I think that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Like I say, when he first brought those songs into the band, and as well, when I brought They Make Me Mad into the band, it had a rock chorus and a reggae verse. They Make Me Mad, and the same with his. They came along and they were kind of rock, and he was singing them, and he'd play away and he'd sing them and that, and we go, okay, you know. And then the members that had been Hard Top 22 were firmly into reggae, said, well, yeah, but if we do this bass line over it, or we play this drum pattern over it, then it becomes this. And that's really the way it came together. And I think that all the best musics come out of fusions. They don't come out of, you know, like pure forms in that way. I think they come out of pure fusions, and that's what moves music forward.
Now, the other thing around Coventry, obviously, that was huge around that time, was Jerry Dammers and his whole idea about two-tone. Were you in awe of Jerry Dammers?
No, I mean, I wasn't. I mean, the man didn't have any teeth as far as I was concerned. He looked pretty peculiar, and I mean, nobody actually knew Jerry Dammers. I mean, Jerry Dammers was just this kind of strange figure who loomed about. I remember going round to his flat one time, and funnily enough, that was the first time I ever met Ranking Roger, because he had Ranking Roger over him. And Ranking Roger was about 16, 17, I think, at that time. And I remember sitting there, and Jerry's girlfriend at that time was in a band called Swinging Cats, which as well went on to make a single with Two-Tone, along with John Shipley, who would later would be in the Special AKA. I remember sitting there thinking, wow, this guy's pretty strange, you know. It's just that he happened to have a flat that was opposite my local pub, the Albany.
Right.
And you knew that here was a man who didn't want you to know anything about him, didn't want to tell you anything about him. But he had this kind of strange aura, I suppose, and you knew he was quite beetle-brained about things. And I mean, nobody could be that weird, that ill kind of dressed. And
but in your Radio 2 programme, I sensed that he was very much either, I don't know if that's sort of looking back through rose-tinted glasses, but he did see the two-tone thing at one point, when it was the specials and the selector, as this 14-person committee that was never going to be this horrible corporate machine, and he was very much waxing...
Oh, we all saw it. I mean, let's put one thing straight, is that Jerry was the founding father of all things two-tone.
Right.
You know, I mean, that was just it. He didn't study, you know, cartoon stuff and animation at Lancaster Polytechnic at the time, so that, you know, he was going to go off and do something else other than come up with the idea of two-tone and Walt Jabsco, you know, the little black and white man. It was... He'd been listening to his John Barry singles, he'd been listening to his Muzak, all of those kind of things, and all of that coalesced into what would be the specials and what would be this thing called two-tone. I think that he was a person who feels things very, very deeply in terms of slight, in terms of fighting, if you like, for some kind of rights for, you know, minorities, that kind of thing. I think that he is weird enough to think that he identifies maybe with minorities in some obscure way. I don't really know. I've never talked to him about that. I've never really been able to have a conversation with Jerry. Jerry is a law unto himself. I don't particularly bother myself with people who don't want to be talked to.
But this notion of the 14-person committee, say when you were setting up the Madness Specials and Selector tour, which was that autumn that you...
Oh, that was way beyond that. I mean, that was way before any committee came together at all.
Really? Right.
The two-tone tour, we were invited onto the two-tone tour. That was... We all shared the same kind of way of thinking, that there was no point making music if it didn't mean something, and this music was a fusion between rock, reggae, and punk, and ska music as well. And there was no point in getting on a stage if you didn't have something to say. And we were all from Coventry, which was a provincial town, that nobody, you know, I mean, I don't know, its main saving grace before had probably been Burt Whedon. That's not actually true. It was Hazel O'Connor, but I mean, you know, I'm not going to quibble about these things. And I guess that when you're from a provincial town and when you come up against bands like Madness, who were from London
and played the Nashville,
were all white, and were all young boys, all nutty boys, and all the rest of it, then yeah, I suppose we must have come across as a right load of bunch of sourpusses. You know, you weren't going to have that much fun with us. You know, fuck art, let's dance. I mean, it's you know, that was no contest kind of thing. But nonetheless, we all three bands came together because we were doing the same kind of music, and we seemed to have this shared dream that why couldn't we go out in this kind of review way of three bands out there, 21 people, all on stage at varying times of the night, and let people come to a place like the Electric Ballroom, you know, in Camden, and stuff for £3, which is what you could come and see those bands for.
And so you realised
that was good myself, you know.
And you realised the dream. Was it enjoyable for you as a woman within that sort of tour bus
being
setup?
with all those guys?
Yeah.
No, it was absolutely shit. I mean, it was absolute shit. I mean, most of the time they were morose, miserable, pulling women with a vengeance, which at that time kind of rubbed up a bit the wrong way, you know, because I mean we were still in the flowering of women's liberation, which I saw myself as at least having some part in, at least
about 5 years after Spare Rib.
You know what I mean?
5 years after Spare Rib,
And also, I mean, in retrospect, I look back at it, and all young men join bands so they can pull women and drink as much beer as they can. Kind of the music is incidental. I see him nodding the camera. But you see, Dumbo here hadn't actually realised that. I was still under the misnomer that you actually joined a band and you really wanted to make this earnest music, and here was a chance to get whatever views you might have had across in songs and blah blah blah. And there were enough women around at that time, i.e. in the Body Snatchers, or our manager at the time, who was a manageress,
Right.
Ms. Juliette Deville, who managed us, the Selector, and worked for Trigger, which was the whole thing that was behind Two-Tone at the time. And we all thought, yeah, you know, sort of women getting up there and all this, and you know, but really that wasn't what it was about at all.
Jumping to and fro a bit in that first autumn, the image of the Selector. You said that when you did those early gigs in Gloucester, you know, you looked like you were
We did
going...
one early gig in Gloucester when we looked really, really, very, very un-two-tone. Like our next gig at the F Club in Leeds, which I mean, you did talk about. Well, that was a hoot. That was because we turned up and we knew we were sporting specials, and that was great. I thought, oh well, you know, nobody will be there, kind of thing. And the place was absolutely rammed. And even for when we went on, and I remember Elvis Costello was there, which was even weirder because I mean he was just somebody I'd seen on Top of the Pops, and he was a very weird man. I remember thinking he was a very weird man at the time, and he trod on my foot at the bar, and I never really forgiven him for that. And then suddenly all these vultures kind of descended on us. The lighting, like we didn't know about lighting rigs, you know, I mean it was a lighting rig kind of thing. But these lighting guys descended on us and said, yeah, well, we want 10 quid for doing your lights, you know. And we went, oh, okay then. I mean, as far as I recall, we were getting a minuscule amount of money for getting it. It had taken us all our money to sort of get up to Leeds. And then the mixing guy turns up. Yeah, well, we want 10 quid for mixing. Oh, bloody hell, you know, this is a bit much, isn't it? So all that got sorted out, and we actually went on, and I think we had our words taped across the front of the stage, which was one of the reasons why Gaps and I, the other singer in the band, kind of ran up and down the stage so much because of seeing the lyrics. And all these people suddenly came out of the woodwork, all these skinheads and things that I hadn't seen since I was about 15 and at school. Because I went to school in Romford, which and our catchment area for our school was Dagenham, so I mean you got loads of skinheads coming to the school anyway, and they listened to ska music, as I recall, and so it was all a bit kind of really strange. We were suddenly in this environment that we thought we were just turning up to do a gig that was not really going to be inhabited by that many people. And here you got Elvis Costello, people asking to be paid for all these kind of things which you'd just taken for granted. And a real PA with real speakers at the front was something which, you know, you normally just had a misassortment of boxes which kind of worked, you know.
So you were in the business, basically. The business was like...
the business was there, and that was it. And it kind of took off from there. And after that, I kind of lost, you know,
and the thing
perspective.
About the image thing.
Well, that's where the hat came from. At that particular gig, I had turned up, and I was sitting in the dressing room, and there were two roadies there from the specials, Trevor and Rex, and they were done out in a whole kind of, tonic suit. And they both had pork pie hats, and Trevor, I think, probably thought that he could try his luck with me. And I always remember the very first thing that ever happened when I walked into the dressing room, because I was there on my own because everyone else was getting the gear out of the bus and everything, was he turkey necked me. Which, to anyone who doesn't know what turkey neck is sort of basically bending over, dropping your trousers and showing your scrotal sack, and which I was quite interested in at the time, I suppose, just because nobody had ever done that before. And he sort of took me aside and said, "Look here, love, try this on." And I tried his pork pie hat, and he said, "Yeah, it looks really good. That does, looks really good." And that was kind of it, sort of thing.
That was the start of the image.
That was the start of the image.
Started that very night,
which all
with
came
a
from a turkey neck, really. And yeah, so I mean, you know, that. So
just to get, you know, this sort of train spotter thing about timing, that must have been around July, August time. You were on Top of the Pops in November. That is very, very fast moving.
I was, hilariously fast in some ways.
How did you deal with it? How did it change you as a person looking back? No,
not really. I mean, it changes you in terms of the fact, I suppose, that you have to get your act together a bit quick. I had to give up my job. Did
you have any reservations about doing that?
No, not really at the time. Well, I suppose I did a bit, but it's kind of, you think, oh, well, you know, I mean, as I say, I mean, I've always been kind of a forward-thinking person. I mean, opportunities only arise once in a lifetime, maybe, so why not? I mean, it all looked like good fun at the time, as it were.
Right.
And
again, a point that was made on your Radio 2 programme by Neil, as it happens, was that the changes in those 3 months, you know, there were 7 people, he described that he saw the Selector as 7 people going through, you know, the music business hype machine, you know, where you go from a pub to Top of the Pops in 3 or 4 months' time. Massive changes going on in 7 people, and he said it was a recipe for mayhem. Now, do you?
Well, I guess it was a recipe for mayhem. I wouldn't, you know, when you've got 7 people, people take things at different rates. I guess. It doesn't bother me if things move fast. The faster things move, the faster, you know, the better I like it, really.
Yeah.
I think everybody thought that Neil was some pill-popping rude boy or something, just because he used to stand up the back and sort of play really, really fast and chew gum all the time. And everybody thought that he was really high on speed. Well, he wasn't. He used to smoke an awful lot of marijuana, but I mean, you know, and so did everybody else at that time. I personally didn't, which I suppose was the reason why I never slowed down. But I used to think that was funny, and I mean, Neil would take an eon to make a decision about something. And to a certain extent, that's what I mean about us just being out of time with each other. I just cannot hang around for that long. You know, if an idea seems like a good idea at the time, go with it. I mean, who knows where it might lead. He's not really like that. So I think for him, that kind of 3 months probably did seem really peculiar. Plus, he'd wanted it for years and years and years. You know, he'd had a lot of dead-end jobs, like, you know, he'd written Too Much Pressure when he was at Lucas Aerospace and things like that. He has a whole story about that, and which I won't kind of, you know, you can ask him about that. And, and various other things. I think he was a toilet janitor at some point in time, you know what I mean? I mean, I was kind of, at least the worst I ever did was kind of have to x-ray people, which is a bit of a bore on New Year's Eve when you don't get drunk, but still, there you go. And so I didn't mind. I just thought that, wow, this is, you know, a roller coaster ride, as it were.
And you joined it?
Yeah, I joined it. I mean, you know, Neil's song Out in the Streets again, you know, I mean, one of the choruses, well, not the chorus, the bridge section says, I feel like a roller coaster. And that's exactly how I felt. But I mean, Neil could articulate that in a song, but unfortunately not quite live it to the same speed as what I could.
Yeah, but you must have felt very, very confident as well, because On My Radio is first-rate pop, isn't it? You were suddenly...
Oh, we didn't know that at the time. I mean, the whole deal was with Two-Tone. Jerry had got this deal together with Chrysalis, where he'd got the Two-Tone label, and he'd been allowed to have a certain amount of money, whereby he could choose bands that he would give £1,000 to go in and record 3 singles. And I think the deal was that 10 singles or 10 bands could be recorded within a year, and Chrysalis were obliged to release 6 of them. But if they didn't really want to release those 6, they didn't have to. I mean, basically everything in the contract was on Chrysalis's side, even to the respect that if the singles weren't a hit, Two-Tone actually paid, not Chrysalis. So, well, I mean, that's the nature of record companies. That's why I don't really have too much of, you know, a mind to have anything to do with them these days. They're all run by arses. Some arses are better than others. That's really all you can say. And but this particular set of arses at the time that inhabited Chrysalis were, you know, to all intents and purposes behind Two-Tone. It was the next big thing as they saw it, so they were prepared to throw some money at it. And we managed to get £1,000, in which we went into Horizon Studios in Coventry, which was opposite the station. Used to be a load of old stables there, and you could still smell the horses, as it were. And it was a dreadful studio when I actually look back on it, but, you know, it had a weird kind of, you know, this Coventry thing. We wanted to do everything in Coventry.
Was that the one where Ghost Town was? This Town is a Ghost Town was written.
I don't think Ghost Town was done there.
It was an 8-track in Coventry.
Well, no, that was in Leamington. I think that was in Leamington. I think it might have been Woodbine Studios, but I'm not absolutely sure. But I know that the Specials did their first album at Horizon Studios. We stupidly did both of our albums on Horizon Studios. First on a 16 track and the second on a 24 track, so I suppose things looked up. But anyway, we went in, we recorded 3 tracks, which was On My Radio, Too Much Pressure and Street Feeling. And on the strength of that, Chrysalis released a single on Two Tone and then signed us as a band, and we joined Two Tone as this 14-member democratic Two Tone, you know, whatever. With all
romantic notion.
All our ideals and all our romantic notions intact,
Yeah. But it didn't last, and there have been various reports.
Well, when people say it didn't last, I mean, how long does anything last? I mean, in the music industry, you can't say things last or they don't last.
Well, it seems the things that I sort of read...
It didn't last for very long, I agree.
Because there was always Chrysalis in the background breathing down.
There was always Chrysalis in the background, but I mean, out of that came, you know, Madness's break, came the break of the beat, came the Body Snatchers, and I don't think that's bad. I mean, that's more than some labels rack up in a bloody lifetime, you know? So I actually don't think that's bad for such a short period of time.
Was leaving it painful, leaving Two Tone painful for you?
Well, no, because everything was painful at that time. So, I mean, that was just one more kind of pin in the doll, as it were. I think Jerry wanted things had begun to get on top of Jerry. Both bands had been to America. America was very, very hard in those days. You had to do like 2 shows a night and things like this, and it was okay if you were on the East Coast or you were on the West Coast, i.e. you were in New York or you were in Los Angeles, but anywhere in between, i.e. that huge great gulf which is basically America and full of fairly odd people who didn't necessarily take warmly to white people and black people playing music in the same band. We'd both been through that mill, and we'd come back to England, tried to have a meeting with each other, which hadn't necessarily gone that way. Jerry was a bit morose, wanted to disband Two Tone while it was at its height, felt that it had become now just a fashion thing, that people were just into sort of, you know,
because American record Chrysalis, they did try to hype it a lot, didn't they? And
well, they did try to hype it. I mean, it wasn't just that. It was, I mean, Americans, it could have been baked beans they were selling. I mean, I think we rather naively went to America feeling that, oh, they're really into it, they're really pushing this, they're really pushing that, blah, blah, blah. And then found that really what we were called was product. Now, product isn't a dirty word now. I mean, you hear everybody sort of talk about those kind of things, you know, we've shifted this amount and blah, blah, blah. And nobody's embarrassed about talking about, you know, we racked up this sales and we racked up that sales, but if we go into this territory, we go in. But I mean, in those days, we were actually embarrassed about talking about that kind of thing. I suppose it was, you know, some kind of hippie trickle down or something, because our parents had grown up with that kind of rubbish, that we still thought maybe the world kind of existed in that way. But all those hippies that had come from the late 60s had all gone on being the bank managers who were actually lending us the money, and the managing directors of our record companies to go out and do what we did, and they saw us as product, and we rather stupidly didn't. But there you go. So we all sat round, and Jerry wanted to disband it. We thought, well, people like Madness had got out, they'd signed to Stiff. The Beat had done a single on Two Tone. They had set up their own label called Go Beat. Was it Go Beat? Go Feet.
Go Feet.
Go Feet. Yeah. And we thought, here we still are. We want to, in some ways, not get away from ska, but at least spread our wings a bit. And we are essentially very different from the Specials. You know, they were very much more a rock orientated ska version, I guess, of you know, the 60s version of ska. And we were more soul-y, kind of reggae-ish influenced. Plus we had the added burden that a big bust-up had happened within our band with Desmond Brown and with Charlie Anderson.
This was just prior to the second album.
This was prior to the second album. And
that was just simply same old story, pressures of the road, pressures of 7 people being...
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that the predominant, well, the main thing I've always thought about the Selector is that 7 very, very strong-minded people came together. And in a way, we were the ones who best represented all the opposites. You know, there was a woman in the band, there was a Rasta in the band, there were more blacks in the band than anyone else. I mean, we had our token white, albeit, I mean, you know, a person who was never ever a token, but I mean, Neil Davis. But the Specials, the Specials were predominantly white with 2 black members in the band. You know what I'm saying? So it was a very, very different thing. I think that because we represented all those opposites, we on stage were absolutely dynamite. We were a great, 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 great live act. But we never, when it came to being in a studio, there was always the one road that was pushing towards reggae and the one road that was pushing towards rock, and that was a hard thing to kind of contain in any kind of way. And there were always clashes of personality. That, and not that I'm necessarily a subscriber to all this kind of astrological shit, but there were 4 Taurians in the band, and myself, a Scorpio, who is the opposite sign to Taurians. And the 2, you know, you can't have that many bulls reigning in one pen, believe me. And particularly not with someone who carries a fairly vicious sting like I do. So it was a recipe in some ways for disaster, and particularly after America. It just kind of, that got to us the most, I think. And when we came back from America, we came back and we started work on the second album. There was a huge, huge row in Horizon Studio. There'd always been bitching going on between Desmond Brown and Charlie, funnily enough, which I could never really understand. I mean, you know, a lot of the band thought Charlie's bass playing was rubbish. I personally didn't. I mean, it was just one of the ingredients that was in the band. And Charlie didn't really like the fact that Neil was like the main songwriter. We also at that point were doing contracts with both the record company, which is Chrysalis, and also sorting out our publishing contracts. And as everyone knows, when it comes down to deciding what the split is going to be on who wrote this song and who wrote that song and how that's all going to go,
became a nightmare.
Then that is a nightmare, particularly when some bands had decided they were going to be terribly democratic about this. UB40 actually, for one, and I really admire them for this, was just to split the money 7 ways. And I think that's probably what's kept them together. And probably what drove us apart, because that was decided not to happen in our band. And that caused, from the very beginning, a big, big rift.
Just as you mentioned the name Desmond Brown, can we just scotch one myth, rumour that's gone into print far too much, which was about, I read in two sort of reputable books, that Desmond Brown, in the beginning, after the hits The Selector, Desmond Brown got together with a guitarist called Kevin Harrison and recruited the band from scratch, and Neil Davis went back to his day job. Now then, Pauline Black, you were there at the time. What happened?
Well, I was there at the time, and that is absolute rubbish. That is absolute rubbish. Kevin Harrison, as far as I was concerned, he was in a band called The Urge, which had nothing to do with two-tone. Some weird little kind of rock outfit which was into Talking Heads and affected some weird kind of thing in that way. I think he knew Neil Davis, for sure. And maybe Desmond had played with him in another band. I mean, everybody in Coventry at that time, all the musicians that were in the Specials or in the Selector, all had played in various other bands, Pharaoh's Kingdom, Chapter 5, a whole load of other bands at that time. But, I mean, Kevin Harrison had absolutely nothing to do with getting the Selector together. The Selector came together from that initial meeting with Charlie Anderson's house.
And Neil was there throughout.
Neil was there throughout.
So that's
Neil never had a day job, as far as I knew. You know, when I knew him, he didn't have a day job.
That's put the record straight on that. I've seen it.
Well, those so-called authentic Bibles of this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
I will go on record as saying most of them are predominantly bullshit.
Well, this one claims to be a discography as well, so they've got to get the facts right. You know, that's
well,
why.
Well, it's not hard to get dates right.
Yeah, that's true.
You know.
Yeah. So now, Celebrate the Bullet. You've gone into the studio. That song is still your favourite Selector song, Pauline?
Well, we don't. I mean, when you say that, Celebrate the Bullet. After Charlie and Desmond left, and we went through that whole acrimonious split, we had to recruit a new bass player and a new keyboard player. And we went into rehearsal in the end room at Horizon Studios. There was a rehearsal room there, and we were in there about a month. I mean, why you need a month to do these things, I don't know. I mean, we certainly don't take a month these days. But in those days, you had that facility. And I can't remember why, but I was away on one of the days. I had to come down to London to do an interview or something like this. And two guys turned up from Lancaster, who were Adam Williams, who would then go on to be the bass player in the Selector, and a guy called James Mackey, who would then go on to be the keyboard player in the Selector. And they had rehearsed them in my absence. I had come back, and there they were, fait accompli. They were coming down to stay in a hotel and rehearse with us. And I took a look at these two people, and I was aghast. I mean, they had nothing to do with what I considered the Selector to be about. The Selector was about strong-minded personalities, and irrespective of whether, you know, Desmond Brown had tried to strangle me at one point in time, had bitten one of madness and had been sort of dragged off by bouncers at a gig in Portsmouth, all these kind of weird and wonderful things which have kind of, you know, descended into Selector myth and are basically true. Then it was like they were characters. They were people who you thought, yeah, that made a band, and maybe we didn't get on that famously when we were off stage, and maybe we did try and half kill each other when we were in the bus or in the dressing room, but on stage it worked and it was magic. And suddenly there was two people who looked like Moomins. I just couldn't believe it, and Neil wanted these people. And from then on, I mean,
that was the beginning of the end.
It was the beginning of the end for me. It was just never the same after that. And,
right.
You know, and in the end, I just parted company. I like the Celebrate the Bullet album. Celebrate the Bullet is still my favourite song.
What's your favourite song from the two-tone movement? You know, outside of the Selector.
Celebrate the Bullet.
Really?
I have to be partisan, why not? You know, no, I suppose from the actual two-tone movement, I'd say probably Too Much Too Young, because it kind of encapsulates everything that was wrong with all of us. I mean, it wasn't just us who was having the problems. And the Specials were having their problems as well. They had their Desmonds and their Charlies, you know what I mean? They just sort of dealt with it differently to us.
But going on to other ones there, Ghost Town and the Selector as two instrumentals, listening to them, they could have been like seen as modern blues, because they did.
Ghost Town wasn't an instrumental.
No, it wasn't an instrumental, but there are instrumental sections to it that very much are bluesy. And when you think when they came out around the time of the riots, was that just coincidence? You know, did the movement sometimes really mirror what was going on?
Well, I think everything that the Special, particularly the Specials and particularly us as well, did mirror what was going on.
Right.
I mean, we were out there, we were doing these gigs, we were on stage at the Hammersmith Palais having a sea of Nazi skinhead Zeke hiding at us and stuff like that, fights erupting in the crowd. And yeah, I mean, imagine what that was like in a band which has 6 blacks in it and 1 white person and a whole load of skinheads at, you know, gigs up and down the country, particularly in Luton, because there seemed to be a big NF movement there. Gigs having to be stopped, people being stabbed, people being, you know, beaten up and stuff. I mean, you wondered where you were. I mean,
it's amazing you stood
like
it for 18 months when you describe it like that.
It was like being in a strange, strange world. Well, it wasn't like that everywhere. But I mean, that happened.
Yeah.
And I mean, people can say, well, shit happens, but it's, you know, plenty of shit happened in that 18 months.
Right. So it wasn't just one reason for your leaving. The new format selector was obviously a major reason, but
There's a whole number of reasons.
did it happen just one day where you said, right, that's it?
No, not at all. It happened over a period of time. Chrysalis got more and more difficult about advances, about the amount of control that they actually had over saying what we should or what we shouldn't do. We parted company with our management. At the time, tried to manage ourselves, which was a big mistake. And Celebrate the Bullet, the actual album, was not that well received. I mean, the main reason being that Celebrate the Bullet, the single, never got the airplay that it should because it was released in the same week that Ronald Reagan was shot. And also John Lennon was assassinated, which really didn't help matters for a song, you know, which was an ironic song. And I think, as Neil would say, was very much brought about by he'd first started thinking about writing that song in respect to the fact that he just felt that there was all this kind of undercurrent of violence that was going on in the world at the time. Also, Ian Curtis had hung himself in New York when we were in New York at the time, and I think that had a big effect on him. It was right, you know, it was just the wrong time to put that song out.
But it must have been a relief then for you to leave the business. No?
I didn't leave the business.
You had a couple of singles
as
after.
such. I left and I signed to Chrysalis. I was managed by a guy called Alan Edwards, who I believe has something to do with the Spice Girls these days. But he had managed Hazel O'Connor, who was also from Coventry at that time, and had spent at least 3 months kind of every now and again just kind of turning up at gigs or whatever, or I just bumping into him at some pub in London and going, you really don't want to be with these guys, blah blah blah, you know, come with me, blah blah, I'll make you a star. You know,
Really?
if I had £5 for everyone who ever
treat.
turned around to me and said, oh, I'll make you a star, then I'd be a very, very rich woman, but I haven't. And he was just useless, right. You know. Well, he was useless for me. He wasn't much better for Hazel, as I recall, you know. But I mean, got tits and an arse and a clutch of really useless songs. He seems to be really good.
So, acting was your main thing
No,
during
not
the
at all.
80s?
It wasn't my main thing. That wasn't the reason why I
TV
left the
presenter?
selector. It's just kind of those things came along. I left to do a solo thing, and I started working and started writing songs. I worked with a lot of different people. I worked with a gospel choir because I thought it would be kind of cool to get a gospel choir to sing political songs. It was the London Community Gospel Choir at the time, and I had a song called Nameless, which is basically about Bobby Sands and his death, which I don't know. I thought was novel at the time for a gospel choir to be singing about this kind of IRA guy. I had to explain the whole context of the song to them, and you know, all hail to them. I mean, they decided, yeah, we can get with that kind of thing. Chrysalis did not like that kind of stuff. They did not like that. I had another song called Cedars of Lebanon, which was basically about kind of the whole Palestinian question and all that was going on there. Tel al-Zatar had happened and stuff. And they were less than enamoured to be releasing an album by a black woman singer about, you know, the IRA or the Palestinian question.
But
or
you
this or
two,
that.
and
I
later
thought
on
it was
Michelle
good.
Shocked, you know, there was success, you know.
Well, yes, they were. You know, I must have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all I can say.
You must have been
Chrysalis weren't into that.
And you must have been very heartened by someone like Michelle Shocked sort of later on doing, you know.
I was heartened by a whole load of people doing stuff later on.
Yeah.
I mean, the best one I thought was probably War Crimes, which the Special AKA did. But again, that was many years, well, not many years, but only 3 years later at least. And I just got fed up with the whole scene, decided that I really didn't want anything more to do with record companies. And I was approached by a guy called Trevor Laird, who played the pill-popping rude boy in Quadrophenia and was also in Babylon. and had come to the premiere actually of Dance Craze, which was at the Astoria, and we'd got chatting there. He'd just got his director's ticket. He was directing a play at the Riverside Theatre here in London and wanted somebody to write some music, and there was a non-speaking part in it. Did I want to come along and get my equity card?
Wow.
Well, I said, yeah, you know,
Wow.
so it was the Pope Catholic kind of thing. So along I went, and from that it kind of went into a speaking part and things like this. I got my equity card, I auditioned for some more, and I got some, you know, other jobs
TV
and
presenting
stuff.
work?
Well, that was, in those days, I remember being up for the Tube, that was one thing.
Oh, right.
Which I always thought was a hoot. And there was that, and there was also this thing called Black on Black. And I think they were just looking for, you know, somebody who they thought could front a program and could do the kind of music-y bits and stuff like that. And so I got involved in that. It just kind of came, do you know what I mean? It wasn't like I went out searching for it. I had any game plan, or it was like anyone these days when you see these people who leave bands and is right, what's my next step in my career? These things just happened, and some of them were good and some of them were absolute rubbish.
But as an overall question, as an overall final question, thanks ever so much for your time. What do you feel most comfortable in front of? TV cameras, or up there on stage, or treading the boards? Where are you happiest?
I'm happiest doing music. I enjoy the whole theatre experience, and I enjoy sort of doing television and stuff like that because it's interesting. But what I most enjoy doing is what I do now, and what I do now is in a band still called The Selector, with different personnel. Yes, I mean, Neil Davis has been a part of this, Gaps Hendrickson has been a part of this, but you know, we've parted our ways. A band which has been in existence now for nearly 13 years, and has you know, 4 albums, original albums that it has put out, have a whole Selector acoustic kind of spin-off of that, and that's where I feel comfortable. I feel comfortable sort of doing what's tomorrow, not kind of, you know, thinking about what went before. Yeah, all of that was good. All of the two-tone thing was good. I would stand up and say that two-tone still means something to people these days, and it does. And I've always felt that the whole thing about two-tone was that we were there and we were occupying that small space in time between 1979 and 1981, between punks and between new romantics. And I think we'll be remembered for a very, very long time for addressing all those questions about racism, about sexism, about what black people and white people playing in a band together actually means. And if nothing else, I think it was a very, very small beacon of light in a very, very dark sky.
Pauline Black, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.